that gave birth to our nation are the ideas that our nation is resistant to right now, and we should talk about that all the time.
In a world where narratives are shaped by corporations and gatekeepers, independent voices matter more than ever. Badlands Media brings together citizen journalists, researchers, and independent thinkers.
The truth is triggering.
Question the narrative. Explore the facts.
It's authenticity, courage, resilience.
Search for the truth others won't.
It's not about being first or being right.
The information war is changing.
It's about being authentic.
Embrace the friction.
Embrace the friction.
Shut the f*** up.
Authentically antagonizing. Join the movement.
I'm going to say how I feel.
Follow Badlands Media.
This is about the future.
The Badlands. What are the Badlands? Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Good evening. Today is Black Monday, the day the Dow dropped more than 500 points.
Please join me in welcoming George Soros.
It's panic. Everyone's everybody would try to find a bottom.
To stand up and do something, become really engaged in the electoral process in this country.
What we have to confront is a deep, systemic, and structural restructuring of our world. And this will take some time. And the world will look differently after we have gone through this transition process.
For centuries, they've been stuffing their stomachs with human flesh, and they've been stuffing their pockets with money. But they must realize that this bowl of vampires is about to end.
We have an army of digital soldiers.
That this is coming. This is going to be a part of a future where we can take back our power in ways we didn't even think about in the industrial age that are coming in the digital age.
But the common people of these countries in their heart, they can feel what's happening. They can see our struggle for our independence, for our true sovereignty. And they see this connection with their aspirations to be truly independent, which is exacerbated by the fact that in the Western elites there is a strong desire to freeze the current unfair state of things in international affairs.
Well, let me tell you something, brother. When they took a shot at my hero, and they tried to kill the next President of the United States, enough was enough. And I said, let Trumpomania run wild, brother. Let Trumpomania rule again. Let Trumpomania make America great again.
People who don't believe are walking dead. They are asleep. And this is the awakening.
Yevgeny Primakov, a former Russian prime minister, foreign minister, and spy chief, has died at the age of 85. Born in the Ukrainian capital of Kiev in 1929, Primakov was brought up in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. After graduating as an Arabic scholar from the Moscow Institute for Oriental Studies in 1953, he went on to be a correspondent for state radio and television. He entered the Soviet parliament in 1988 then played a prominent role in failed efforts to avert the 1991 Gulf War, when Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev sent him to negotiate in Baghdad with Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Primakov was made head of the Foreign Intelligence Service and was appointed foreign minister in January 1996. Having left government in 1999, Primakov indicated he would run in the 2000 presidential election, but dropped out when Kremlin power brokers united around the bid of Vladimir Putin. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters that President Vladimir Putin had been informed of Primakov's death and was deeply saddened, but gave no other details.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the show. This is the Book of Trump, episode 55, I believe. The Origins of the Sovereign Alliance is what I'm calling this. And tonight we are going to be joined by a special guest. I'll go ahead and bring him on. And that is Warhamster. Warhamster, Brady, how are you?
Cheers. Thanks for having me on. I'm doing great. Always
Absolutely.
a pleasure to hang out with my good friend, Ghost of Base Patrick Henry.
Absolutely, man. Welcome back to the program. You've been here before. We are going to hit a sponsor before we get rolling on here, but the subject, I'll just introduce it first. Been speaking to Brady a bunch lately, and the subject of Yevgeny, I think I'm saying his name right, Primakov, came up, and he basically is the political mentor of both Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov. And if you look into the Primakov Doctrine, as Brady will tell you, you can't understand Vladimir Putin or Sergei Lavrov for that matter unless you understand the Primakov Doctrine. And so we are going to be talking about the Primakov Doctrine tonight. And it's pretty mind-blowing when you go and you look at all the things that this guy was working on and what he was doing in back in the 90s and in the 2000s. And these plans that he was laying that appear to all be coming to fruition right now. So with that said, I'm going to play a quick video and then we will get into it. So that video is right here.
3 boys taught me 2 things. Summer is an adventure and bugs are relentless. As an herbalist, I know you don't need harsh chemicals to protect your family. Here at Tamarack Garden, we've got you covered with natural sunscreen, mosquito and tick repellent that's even safe for your pets, a salve to draw out bug bites, and soothing sunburn cream, all made with the power of plants. Because we think summer memories should last longer than the bug bites. Tamarack Garden, protect your family naturally and eat your weeds.
All right, and that's badlandsmedia.tv/Tamarack. And shout out to our friends at Tamarack, who we just saw at GART in Deadwood and love seeing them at GART. So badlandsmedia.tv/Tamarack. All right. So Brady, let's talk about Yevgeny Primakov. Where do we start?
Well, before we jump into that, I think the audience would find it interesting. Before either you or I ever got behind a camera and started doing these podcasts, you and I used to have these conversations on the phone on a regular basis. Just trying to figure out exactly how the world works. So that's how Gordon and I have been having these discussions for a long time. And when he asked me about Primakov, I did this homework about 5 years ago. In fact, and leading up to the Ukraine war, I really dug into it deep. So I had to scramble to go through all my old notes. But I did find some good stuff here. I think where we start is when Baker, with the fall of the Soviet Union, where the United States, basically said NATO will not expand 1 inch further towards Russia. And I think that's the starting point of this conversation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's do this with the maps, okay?
Yep.
I will have that right here. And it's interesting. Just in the last week, I had some article about did Baker actually say will not expand 1 inch further? Something was in the news just last week, and I didn't bookmark it. But he really did. He did promise Russia that if the Soviet Union fell, and we know what happened afterwards. All kinds of American business interests went in there, exploited Russia. That's how we got all the Russian oligarchs. It became a giant giveaway. But in the meantime, you can see on the left here, this is 1990. Soviet Union had all these Eastern European countries in the blue. And here in 2019, pretty much up until we get to Ukraine, it's all joined NATO. And that's a huge encroachment, upon your front door. And make no mistake about it, NATO is a military alliance. And if the military alliance keeps creeping closer and closer on your doorstep, you're not going to be that comfortable about it. Let me take this one down, and I'll pull up the other map. I think this shows it even better. There we go. And this is not that recent, but you can see 14 different countries have joined NATO, even though we promised we wouldn't creep up on Russia's doorsteps. So they've got a reason to be a little bit, shall we say, paranoid.
Yeah, and this all culminated in the NATO-Russia Founding Act on Mutual Relations, which was on mutual relations, cooperation, and security between NATO and the Russian Federation, which was signed on May 27th, 1997 by NATO Secretary General Javier Solana and Russian Foreign Minister Primakov, with leaders from both sides present in Paris. This political agreement established a framework for consultation and cooperation between the 16 NATO members and Russia, aiming to build a, quote, stable, peaceful, and undivided Europe, and marking a shift from Cold War confrontation to partnership. It said the key provisions included the creation of a NATO-Russia Permanent Joint Council to facilitate dialogue on political and security matters, while explicitly stating that the act did not grant Russia a veto over NATO decisions. Crucially, NATO reiterated its 3 no's, having no intention, no plan, and no reason to deploy nuclear weapons or station substantial combat forces on the territory of new member states, though it reserved the right to maintain adequate infrastructure or reinforcements. So we can see how all that was a lie. They pretty much just went back on every single promise they made. They violated this agreement. Yeah, this is pretty despicable, actually, by NATO and by the United States.
Yeah, well, all this is going on, again, these Russian oligarchs, basically organized crime, are just basically exploiting all the old Soviet resources. And yeah, they basically have criminal cartel systems built up. And you get some nationalist Russians in the 90s said enough is enough. And that's the camp that Putin and Primakov and everyone came from, whereas Yeltsin was probably a little bit more of a puppet of the oligarchs. There is a reason there is an incredibly expensive neighborhood in England called Moscow on the Thames. And this is where all these Russian oligarchs live. It's the multinational syndicate at work in Russia, which created absolute chaos, destroyed the Russian economy, exploited all the resources. And coming out from that are a bunch of Russian nationalists says enough is enough organized crime. And that's where these people come from.
Yeah, you're referring to the aluminum wars, which we covered in one of the episodes on this show with Burning Bright, I guess sometime last year. So I encourage people to go back and listen to that. But when you go look in the archives, look for the aluminum wars, and we go into detail about exactly what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed and how these oligarchs exploited the system that was put in place to basically take control of everything when it all was privatized.
Yeah, the other flip side of this is the monetary, hegemony. You go back in Western history, the first real reserve currency for about 100 years was the Dutch guilder, and that's where the Dutch Republic basically created what we call modern capitalism, the joint stock company, the first central bank. All that stuff came from the Netherlands. Well, they ended up over securitizing their economy, exported everything to England, and then the City of London arises from that. The British banking system that became the British Empire, and the British pound for a couple hundred years was the default reserve currency. British Empire overextends itself. We've got the quote unquote the Great Rapprochement with the U.S. and England. I've been talking a little bit about the real history of the Monroe Doctrine. Didn't really start till 1895, but what ends up happening post World War I, post World War II, is we get what's now known as the rules-based dollar hegemonic economic system. And if you're going to participate in the dollar-based economy, you've got to play by our set of the rules. And we just did a really big show on that with the Colonel on Friday. So people should go check that out on her channel or mine. But so here we have this Russia coming in out of the Cold War, and they got to enter this dollar-backed economic system. And they started way behind the 8 ball, tons of corruption going on. a very weak ruble, and rising from these ashes, trying to create stability and a stable national country. We've got Primakov. Pretty good background.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to share this PDF that I downloaded because this article is no longer available online, but I was able to track down the original scanned version of it, hard copy of it. So this is from the Heritage Foundation, from issue number 167, published on December 15th, 1997. And it's entitled "The Primakov Doctrine, Russia's Zero-Sum Game with the United States," written by Ariel Cohen. And I'll just read the first opening paragraph, which is like one sentence, basically. It says, Russian Foreign Minister Eugenie, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, Primakov, it's spelled differently every single time I see it. Primakov is claiming credit for calming Saddam Hussein during the recent Iraqi crisis. However, Primakov's role in temporarily diffusing the crisis should be seen not as an exercise in diplomatic finesse, but as an important sign of Russia's new post-Cold War foreign policy and as part of a larger strategy to challenge America's leadership role in global security. I'll read this next sentence as well. The purpose of this strategy is to build a Eurasian counterbalance to the American-led Atlantic Alliance by forging closer ties between Russia, China, and potentially Iran. This goal was evident in early 1996 when Primakov and his then Iranian counterpart, Foreign Minister Ali Akbar Velayati, issued a joint statement describing the foreign military presence in the Persian Gulf as totally unacceptable. Moscow and Beijing already have come together in what their leaders refer to as a strategic partnership and would like Iran and possibly India and France to join their efforts as well. The goal of Primakov's policy, obviously, is to weaken U.S. influence in the Middle East and in Eurasia and to establish Russia and the Middle East as a power equal to the United States. Under Primakov, Russia seems intent on excluding the United States from influencing issues involving the former Soviet area while strengthening China's position. And I'll give you a second to respond to that if you'd like. Otherwise, I just want to hit on some of these topics that are brought up throughout this article.
Well, the first thing I noticed is they talked about Russia, Iran, and China, but the original Primakov triangle was Russia, India, and China. They call it the RIC triangle. Now, this is way before the concept of BRICS had ever even been thought up, and we'll get into that. But Iran was not originally part of this. This was Russia, India, China was their triangle. And again, he was talking about this well in advance, of the Kosovo War, which really kind of Russia had to react to NATO expansion after that. Perception of U.S. unilateralism after the Soviet collapse, which we talked about. But go on with the article. There's more to it. But I just think it's really important that India was initially part of what his vision was, not Iran.
Yeah, and that's right. That's also what I read as well. And I also just want to bring this up. We've brought this up before in previous episodes, but so this article again is published in December of 1997, and this book is published a few months later in 9 months later, September of 1998, and it's by Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Grand Chessboard. And basically, his big thesis is that the West cannot allow an alliance between Russia, Iran, and China to happen. And so ostensibly he is responding to the Primakov Doctrine, it would appear.
That's so funny Brzezinski would say that, because people should remember it was Brzezinski that did the secret mission on the orders of the Rockefellers to China to open up, China in the first place before Nixon went over there and signed the deal. Not long after that, of course, we shifted to create the World Trade Organization and eventually ushered China into it, basically outsourced billions of Western jobs. It's all part of the same conversation. But it's interesting that Brzezinski, that was his line in the sand, even though he's the one that helped make it happen.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so these two paragraphs, I think, actually give us some good background into what Primakov was doing prior to the 90s. So it says, the spy who came in from the Cold War. The roots of this strategy go back to the Cold War, which gave birth to shrewd foreign policy operators, such as Russia's current foreign minister, Primakov. Primakov was the quintessential Soviet establishment insider. He was born in Kiev, interesting, in 1929. In the 1950s, while working for the Russian Broadcasting Authority, he was trained by the Soviet KGB as an Oriental scholar and speaker of Arabic and English. In the 1960s, he rose to the position of head of the Arabic Broadcasting Service of Radio Moscow. In 1962, he began working for the International Department of the Central Committee of the USSR Communist Party as a senior commentator and Pravda correspondent in the Middle East. He became the expert on the Middle East for Leonid Brezhnev's government. Primakov played an important role in the 1970s and 1980s in formulating the Soviet Union's policy in the Middle East and South Asia. He authored the Communist Party's most authoritative ideological justification for the 1979 invasion of Afghanistan. In his writings, he has lamented the 1980 through 1988 Iran-Iraq war as a diversion from the struggle against imperialism in the United States, while calling for the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, to overcome its internal differences in order to pursue its struggle against Israel. Primakov has befriended and supported Saddam Hussein of Iraq, Hafez al-Assad of Syria, that's Bashar al-Assad's father, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, and Yasser Arafat, leaders of the anti-American camp in the Middle East. He maintains close personal relations with these leaders to this day. So that's a pretty good background here. It just goes on down here to mention that in late 1990 and in January 1991, as special advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev, Primakov undertook 2 last-minute missions to prevent the Gulf War. He sought a resolution that would allow Iraq to retain occupied Kuwait while preventing the United States from using force against Saddam. These missions were designed to undermine then Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze, who had pursued a policy of cooperation with the U.S.-led coalition. That's interesting. So he basically is going to Iraq to undermine the Soviet Union's foreign minister to try to prevent the Gulf War from happening. I don't know if you have anything on that, but if not, I'll jump down to this next section.
Jump away.
Okay. So down here, it says, and I will post a link to this archived PDF in the comments. I encourage everyone to go read this whole article. This is a fantastic article, and it talks about a lot of things that we talk about on all the various shows on Badlands. So, and again, this was published in 1997. It says this next section is called Primakov's View, a Brave New Multipolar World. And so what's important before I start reading is my understanding, a lot of the writers that I'm reading who are writing about Primakov in the past 10, 15 years are all just basically crediting him as like the father of the concept of multipolarity, like the multipolar world order that Xi Jinping talks about, that Vladimir Putin talks about, that many of these world leaders talk about. Even President Trump has talked about it. And so this guy is credited as the creator, basically the author of that concept. So it says, according to various staff members of the foreign ministry in Moscow, Primakov views Russia's international role as preventing a monopolar world dominated by a single superpower. In speeches, articles, and press conferences, he states incessantly that the post-Cold War world is developing along several poles or focal points, which include the United States, Russia, the European Union, and it says it's including, I think, the Soviet Union countries with Russia, the European Union, China, Japan, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and Latin America. Primakov's worldview has no place for a single superpower, despite the current dominant status of the United States. By promoting this multipolar model, Primakov is attempting to dilute American international power. His version of multipolarity also provides cover for a Russian-Chinese strategic partnership, which may welcome the Islamic Republic of Iran as a junior partner. Such a coalition could challenge the United States in 2 vital regions, the Persian Gulf and the Taiwan Strait. In addition, Primakov wants an exclusive Russian sphere of influence in the Caucasus and Central Asia. He claims that CIS countries, I think that's the former Soviet Union countries, must integrate with Russia. He supports union with Belarus, and he advocates Russia's use of force in the former Soviet Union. And so then it kind of breaks down into subsections, and I'll just really quickly rattle these off. The first one is the China connection. It says, since 1991, the Russian military industrial complex has been selling China its most advanced weapons, including ballistic missile systems, nuclear weapons technologies, and modern aircraft at a cost of at least $2 billion per year. China's military modernization program is aimed primarily at establishing control over the Taiwan Strait. Says it may also be designed to challenge Taiwan militarily in just a few years. Such a scenario, which would hinder the ability of the United States to project power and influence in Asia, would be advantageous to Russia under the premises of the Primakov Doctrine. The leaders of Russia and China are calling the relationship a strategic partnership for the 21st century. The next one is Yevgeny, which is Primakov of Arabia. So I think it's like an allusion to Lawrence of Arabia. It says Primakov is also working to strengthen America's foes and weaken its allies in the Middle East. He is personally leading Russia's reapproachment with Tehran and is supporting involvement by the Russian natural gas monopoly Gazprom, together with the French company Total, in developing gas fields and pipelines in Iran. He approves of legitimate civilian nuclear cooperation between Russia and Iran, while flatly denying that Russia is supplying nuclear weapons technology, ballistic missile systems, or other modern weapons to the Ayatollahs, despite ample evidence from intelligence sources to the contrary. So basically, this article from the Heritage Foundation is designed to, from the neocon framing, it's designed to, it really leans into Djangoism, and it's being very provocative, and it's saying, yeah, the Soviet Union is done, but Russia's back and they're bigger and badder than ever, and they're our greatest enemy. And again, this is 3 years before Putin shows up. So this is even before Putin is there. They're identifying Russia here as an enemy. So then it goes back to Baghdad, and it says in the most recent crisis involving Iraq, Primakov put together a coalition in the UN Security Council, which included Russia, China, and France, to oppose the use of force by the United States against Saddam Hussein. He promised Saddam that he would work for the lifting of sanctions, and even demanded that Iraq's self-proclaimed progress in complying with UN decisions be recognized. Primakov has 3 priorities for Baghdad, which will benefit Russia. 1, the resumption of sales of oil, which will allow Iraq to repay its $7 billion debt for Soviet weapons purchased in the 1980s. 2, the fulfillment of Saddam Hussein's pledge to order 4,000 battle tanks from the ailing Russian military-industrial complex, which could save the crumbling Russian arms industry. And 3, the lifting of UN sanctions so that such powerful Russian oil companies as Lukoil can begin implementing their agreements with Iraq to develop multi-billion-dollar oil and gas projects, such as the Western Kurna oil field.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
Because I was going to bring up a point. After the Cold War was really good for business if you're part of the military-industrial complex, because it's an arms race nonstop. You've got guaranteed profits year after year after year with ridiculous markups. The Berlin Wall falls, and you're in the military-industrial complex. You've got to have an enemy, real or imagined. So you have to have a boogeyman out there to continue to justify the military-industrial complex spending here in America and throughout Europe as well, because that's big business there as well. Russia's got a military-industrial complex that used to be state-owned, and you can't privatize it. They didn't have a boogeyman to go after. But they still have to keep up technologically. How are you going to finance that with a really, really young economy that's going to take a decade or two to even come close to developing? They're in bad financial products. They are in really bad financial straits in the 90s, and it's really important.
That's interesting. I just want to connect what we just read to modern times. This is from January 8th, 2026. Iraq to nationalize West Kurna to oil field operations, government says Iraq's cabinet has approved plans to nationalize operations at the West Kurna to oil field, one of the world's largest, as the government looks to avert disruptions stemming from U.S. sanctions imposed on Russian stakeholder Lukoil. State-run Basra Oil Company will take over the oil fields operations for 12 months, 2 officials at the firm told Reuters. And Lukoil, we've identified in other episodes as being a potentially nefarious entity within Russia. There's multiple different energy companies operating in Russia that have different degrees of state involvement, and they don't all seem to be operating on the same page. It seems like some of them are better than others in terms of their earnest operations. Lukoil is one that I think has been identified by both the West and also like by the Trump administration, but also it seems Putin as having some corruption issues. So it is interesting that this is the exact same oil field that the author is mentioning back in 1997, and now it has been nationalized by the Iraqi government this year. So going back to the 1997 story, this next paragraph is pretty interesting. It says Primakov is taking steps to tell me if this sounds familiar at all. Primakov is taking steps to improve Russia's position in Iraq and throughout the Middle East so that once again Russia is seen as a friend of the Arab cause. If both Iran and Iraq break out of containment, America's allies in the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Israel, will be threatened. Another war in the Middle East would result in large casualties and drive up oil prices, undoubtedly benefiting both Iran and Russia. To placate the Arab regimes, Primakov has called for the multilateralization of mediation efforts in the Arab-Israeli peace process, and he is demanding the participation of Russia and the European Union. In a recent interview, he stated that, quote, the process of political settlement has come to a point in time when the monopolization of peacemaking efforts by any single side does not create favorable conditions for progress. So that sounds very, very familiar to what we've been dealing with over the past, 6 months.
Yeah, I just think the timing is really interesting. 1995, what was formerly known as GATT, which is the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, turns into the World Trade Organization, the WTO. That was 1995. And that's really an Anglo-American based order that everyone's got to play by our legal rules. And that's when Russia starts to say, wait a minute, let's put the brakes on this. So I think the timing is fascinating. And they realize that, they're with NATO encroaching on our doorstep, Russia's a gigantic country. What is it, like 12 time zones? They've got to have a release valve and friendly neighbors to their south and to their east, because it's not happening to the west.
So here in this next paragraph, this author accuses Primakov says Primakov is using arms sales and intelligence support to authoritarian and anti-Western regimes as a means to regain Russian influence in the Middle East. The same policies he pursued as the USSR's top Middle Eastern expert in the 1970s and 80s. On his watch, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service started training Iranian intelligence operatives who are engaged in terrorism around the world. Then it says Moscow forgave 50% of Libya's $4 billion debt for weapons purchases in the 1970s and 80s. Primakov is thought to be behind a huge pending sale of arms to Damascus, which is Syria, which will bankrupt Syria, which already owes Russia $10 billion, and will receive modern weapons worth an additional $2 to $3 billion. And then in the next paragraph, this is an interesting irony, considering in the past few weeks, the past month, we've seen Trump and Erdogan meet at the NATO summit. We've seen the issue of the F-35 sale to Turkey dominate the headlines. These are planes, by the way, that Turkey already paid for in 2019. We just simply haven't transferred the airplanes yet. We have trained the pilots already. We trained them back in 2019. The reason we haven't transferred the airplanes is because Russia sold its S-400 ballistic missile defense system or anti-aircraft ballistic missile system to Turkey. Well, listen to this paragraph. In another destabilizing move, Russia agreed to supply Cyprus with its state-of-the-art anti-aircraft, anti-ballistic missile system, the S-300, which Turkey already has threatened to destroy. This step is aimed at exacerbating the conflict between the two NATO allies, Greece and Turkey, on the eve of NATO expansion. Moreover, terms of the contract for the supply of this modern system remain murky, and it is not clear whether it will allow Cyprus to transfer the S-300 system to Iran, Iraq, or Libya. And so remember, I believe it was in 1979. Maybe it was 1969, somewhere in that decade. Turkey took over the northern half of the island of Cyprus, which is in the Eastern Mediterranean, off the coast of Turkey. Cyprus, of course, is a Hellenic culture, meaning it's a Greek culture. So it's aligned closely with Greece. And in this situation, because Russia, of course, was not a friend of Turkey back then. Turkey was in NATO. And of course, there's history between the Ottomans and the Russians, bad blood. And so the Russians here are talking about selling their S-300 system to Cyprus. And Turkey is saying, if you do that, we're going to blow that thing up. We're going to blow up whatever system you send to Cyprus. We're going to blow up. Now, fast forward, 30 years now, and Russia has sold the S-400 system to Turkey, and Turkey is now basically being abused by its NATO allies because it has accepted these weapon systems from Russia. So interesting turn of events over the past 30 years.
Yeah, I used to, 20 years ago, I shared an office with a guy who's from Cyprus, and he was actually there when all this stuff went down. He had some fascinating stories about it. They do not like each other, the Turks and the Greeks, at all. I mean, you want to talk about bad blood? That will never be mended. That feud, that is Hatfield McCoy's big time, and something's got to be done about it because they're sharing the island. It's a tiny island. They're sharing it 50-50. And I'll point out that Cyprus is also a huge route for money laundering out of Ukraine. When we talked about, oh God, who's my favorite oligarch out of there? Remind me of his name.
Igor Kolomoisky.
Kolomoisky's money all came through Cyprus to America. And so now he owns 50% of the skyline in Cleveland, Ohio, and about 40% of the skyline in Louisville, Kentucky. Kolomoisky cannot set foot in the United States himself, but he's got billions of dollars of investments here. And that was the guy who initially put Zelensky into power. So that's a Cyprus connection as well. So
yeah. Well, and we are going to do a Kolomoisky episode on the show, and I want you to come back and do that episode with us.
I would love to just dust off some old notes. We went into that pretty deeply a few years back when that whole thing first started.
Yeah, we did. That was like 4 or 5 years ago now. Okay, so now we are looking at, it brings up Tajikistan, it brings up Azerbaijan. It looks like it's bringing up Armenia. And then it says the Treaty of Unification with Belarus was a victory for Russia's neo-imperialist faction. Primakov was instrumental in negotiating this arrangement and now wholeheartedly supports and promotes it. He views union with Belarus as a geopolitical response to NATO expansion, which would bring Russian troops to the Polish border and extend Russia's presence on the borders of Ukraine and Lithuania. Provisions of the Union Treaty unite Russia with the most politically oppressive and economically retrograde neo-Stalinist regime in Europe, a step seen by Russian hardliners as the first step to reunification of the old Soviet Union. However, repressive actions by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, such as the arrest of Russian television crews and members of Belarusian opposition groups and the closing of newspapers, as well as concerns in Moscow regarding the costs of reunification, have slowed the unification process. So they're citing concerns about Belarus and Russia uniting and Belarus just becoming part of Russia. That still to this day hasn't happened, although Lukashenko still president, and Belarus is obviously firmly in the orbit of Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, without a doubt. I've been reading a lot about that lately. Belarus they'd like to keep their independence, but they are very much dependent on Russia as a kind of a big brother, both for military, but also for their markets. They do have a free trade agreement between the two of them, and Belarus is very isolated from the rest of the region politically. So, yeah, we'll see what happens with that. That's one we definitely want to keep an eye on, and that is why Ukraine has been threatening Belarus, for the last couple of years, and they don't want to draw another front into the war, but hopefully that's coming to an end one of these days. You want to jump into the Primakov Doctrine itself, or are we?
Yeah. Let's go. I mean, so we pretty much hit the whole article. It just kind of circles back and just does like a conclusion where it talks about how Russia is basically using Iraq as its foothold to get into the Middle East and then exercise its influence. And it's interesting because what ends up happening is then 6 years after this article is published, we go into Iraq and take out Saddam, and then that basically pushes Russia into Syria, and so then Assad and Putin become buddies, and the rest is history. So interesting how this like chessboard, as Brzezinski described it, the grand chessboard. It's like this really is like a chessboard. It's like they're like, oh, we're going to go into Iraq. Oh, you are? Okay, we're going to destroy Iraq and overthrow its government. And like now you can't go into Iraq. Interesting.
And it's really it's Russia's reaction to this is really understandable. They're getting bullied by the U.S. It's because we have the reserve currency and these World Trade Organization tariffs and trade agreements. What we call free trade is not free trade. They go in there, we send our negotiators in there, say, look, we'll lower your tariffs on these items, but not these, and we'll lower ours on these and these. What it's basically doing is it's handing out benefits for our multinational corporations and some of their, whoever we're dealing with. And then you set up these investors trade dispute agreements, where basically you're giving away your own sovereignty to be settled by an international board of panel of like 3 judges. And we talked about this on I talked about this on a show with Matt like a couple of years ago. These ISDS investor state dispute settlements, but it basically allows the Anglo-American order to create rules and thrust trade upon anybody who wants to do business with a dollar. And if you don't do it with a dollar, there's all kinds of problems. It is a absolute hegemonic system. And that's what Primakov's talking about. You've been bullying us around for too long. We want to be treated as equals. And, true capitalism is you and I want to you want to give up something of value. You want something of value for me, and you're willing to give me something of value. If we both agree that the thing we're getting is of equal value, that's trade. If it's done any other way, it's coercion. And that's what's forcing Russia's hands, is we're coercing them to do trade on our, basically favoring on conditions that favor our multinational corporations to their disadvantage. And that's not a way for, longevity, long-lasting equal relations. And that's all Primakov has basically been saying since 1996 is, look, this has to be a multipolar order. So we have more than one choice of who we trade with. If you're going to offer us a bad deal, we need to go a different direction. It's just simple economics 101.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have were you able to find the doctrine? I've
got my notes from it, and I'll just sum it up.
So do I. So we can just talk about the sections from it and what it basically generally covers. And I'll share this before we get started. So this is from 2014, and this is from TASS, Russian news agency, which is TASS is like the closest thing you're going to get to a Russian state media. And this is from October 28th, 2014, so 12 years ago. It says Lavrov predicts historians may coin a new term, the Primakov Doctrine. Russia's prominent scientist Yevgeny Primakov, who was former foreign minister and prime minister of Russia, turns 85 on October 29th, and then he ends up dying the following year in 2015. So this is before he dies. This is Lavrov saying that the Primakov Doctrine is going to be like a pretty significant element of history.
What was I going to say? And basically, when I've always talked about the Primakov Doctrine, it's basically three main pillars. And if you know these 3 pillars, all Russian foreign policy since around 2000 makes perfect sense. And it's a big deal what are those 3 pillars? First one, of course, which you already touched on a little bit, is obviously, I'm reading my own notes. The world is or should be multipolar, not unipolar under U.S. dominance. Russia must actively promote a system of several power centers, including Russia, China, India, Europe, to counter American hegemony. It's pillar number 1. I think you've done a good job of explaining why they feel that way. If the U.S. dollar is everything, if the U.S. dominates everything, it's unfair competition. I read an economist about 10 years ago said that the fact that the dollar is the reserve currency basically boosts every American's net worth by 20 to 25%. So if we lost our dollar dominance, we'd all be about a third less wealthy here in America. I make a counter argument that if we had freer trade around the world, that is a sacrifice I'm willing to make to have freer trade and less rigged trade, the way the system currently is, because we don't have free trade at all, and we have not for a long, long time. but a true capitalist free trade system would rise. All boats would rise with the high rising tide. I think it'd be worth it, but I don't know if we'll ever find out in our lifetime. The dollar.
I would agree. I would agree with you, by the way.
But that it may or may not happen.
Well, no, I would agree with you that if we don't have free trade, and the way our system's set up is basically these oligarchs can go use slave labor in the third world to manufacture goods, and then they can just bring those cheap goods to our markets, flood our markets with cheap goods. It destroys our manufacturing base, our industrial base, which makes us poor. So even though we can go buy cheap stuff and we can get things at lower prices, we don't actually have real wealth because real wages don't increase because we're not making anything. We have a speculation based economy.
Yeah, and that ties into the whole idea of globalization. You cannot get one world government as long as there are independent sovereign nation states. And as long as Russia is strong, the United States is strong. Any strong, you don't get your globalization, you don't get your one world government. And various factions throughout the last century plus have always moving us towards one world government. So this really is that's why it's such an important conversation. Is we want strong sovereign nations to be trading freely amongst each other. And the bottom line is it's also the best way towards world peace. Because if you and I are having a good trading relationship, we're very unlikely to attack each other. Because we don't want to wipe out the profits of profit.
Yes.
So
Entanglement.
Mutually beneficial relationships tend not to go to war.
Yeah. And look at what we just read in the other article, that he was going into Iraq and he was like, hey, we want to and Iran, and he's saying, hey, we want to bring energy infrastructure to your countries. We want to bring nuclear energy to Iran. We want to bring oil pipelines to Iraq. That's economic entanglement.
Yeah, there's a big reason they cut the what was the name of the pipeline from Russia to Germany. They absolutely wanted to blow that relationship apart. As long as Germany is dependent upon Russian oil and natural gas, you're gonna have a tough time committing. Europe is as deeply into the Ukraine cause as possible. I don't know. You've probably covered it a million times over, but yeah, Ukraine definitely blew the pipeline.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So the second pillar of the Primakov Doctrine: opposition to unilateral Western intervention.
And I have opposition to NATO expansion, but it's basically saying the same thing.
Yes, yeah, and the example that I believe he gives is the Kosovo crisis of 1999, which you already mentioned, the bombing of Yugoslavia, where Serbia basically becomes a war zone, and we actually had a veteran from that war on the show to talk about his experience there, and because he was a commander in Serbia for a time, in Kosovo for a time. And so we've talked actually extensively. We've done a few episodes on the Kosovo crisis and exactly what happened, why it happened, the fallout from it. And as Primakov said, he said the gesture, his position was not simply a sentimental support for Serbia. It reflected a wider concern. If NATO could use force without Security Council authorization in Yugoslavia, a precedent might be established for intervention elsewhere, including in areas Russia considered strategically important. And we certainly learned that was the case.
Third pillar talks about the strategic partnerships with, again, China, India, and other non-Western powers. And as you've been saying, the rest of the Eurasian countries to Russia's south. And that makes perfect sense. That goes back to, if the power on your west is not trading with you fairly, you need to have other markets. You cannot be isolated and still survive. And that's exactly what part of the doctrine is. And it makes perfect sense. So you cannot fault his logic here. He's a Russian working for Russian interests. But
yep. And the error that I think guys like Ariel Cohen, who wrote that article we were reading, make is like, his title of the article was the zero-sum game. So the neocons are looking at this as a zero-sum game. In order for America to win, somebody has to lose. And so that somebody, of course, is going to be Russia. So if Russia is winning, if Russia is being successful in their geopolitical platform, their geopolitical ambitions, then that means America is somehow losing. And so Russia getting along with India, Russia getting along with China, Russia getting along with Iran, that's bad for America. And I would argue that is only true if all these other countries view America as a hostile force, as like a hostile actor, and that they need to subdue. Which is kind of what you're seeing happening right now with Israel in the Middle East. Like all these countries who have all individually had issues with Israel, but have never actually been aligned, over the past century, now suddenly find themselves all cooperating and being on the same page and putting all their differences aside. And now they kind of share this common enemy, Israel. It's spelling disaster, I think, for the Zionist cause.
Yeah, it's interesting. When Primakov first started suggesting the RIC, which is the Russia, India, China triangle, it's like early 2000s. China was initially very, very reluctant. And they would warm to the idea over time. China's caution probably had a lot to do with a U.S. economic aggression. We certainly did inspire it. We kind of drove, it kind of drove former enemies together.
Yep.
I may as well bring this up. Okay, so the concept of BRICS has been in everyone's lexicon for at least the last 5-6 years, especially in our corner of the internet. Everyone talks about BRICS. Originally it was BRIC, B-R-I-C, and it had nothing to do with any kind of economic alliance. It was actually a marketing term. Investment theme actually came up in 2001. And Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill coined the term BRIC. There was no South Africa wasn't there then, and he talked about it called Building Better Economic BRIC, BRICs. He highlighted Brazil, Russia, India, and China as the 4 largest emerging market economies with high growth potential that could challenge the G7 by 2050. A few years later, they expanded on the idea and launched some mutual funds with that basically that investment idea and some ETFs. That's where the concept of BRIC came from. South Africa got added sometime around 2012. 10 years later, they finally started having like some actual BRICS meetings. So it now does exist as an agreement loosely, but to me, it's like the European Union. You cannot have a monetary coalition unless you have got a political coalition, and that's going to be very difficult for any of the BRICS members. Even if they come to these great economic agreements or try their own currency and stuff like that, whether it be crypto, gold, back, what have you. We've heard all these theories. I think it's going to be very difficult to enforce any side of those agreements. I like the idea of a multipolar world, but this whole BRICS is too different politically. And you just go back to the very beginning of the RICs, Russia, India, China. They had a tough time even doing more than even penciling a sketch because they have different national goals and needs. They're demographically different. They're geopolitically different. They have different ties. And India continues to do whatever the heck it wants and trade with whoever they want. They're not actually moving towards that. So it's a pretty messy situation. But like I said, there's dollar is still king and should remain so for the near future.
Yeah. Similar. It's a similar story to like what happened with the Confederacy in the Civil War with all the different southern states printing their own currency and the exchange, the exchange rates and all the issues they had with trying to regulate amongst themselves and trade amongst themselves and do bookkeeping.
Let me jump in on that one because I may have a little bit different take on that. I did a show about Lincoln's counterfeiters. Mm-hmm. And really one of the 2 main reasons the Union won the war was because of counterfeit dollars. The South was actually running on sound money, that gold-based currency. Well, the North creates the greenback, which is a fiat
greenback.
Yep. So when you've got a whole counterfeiting ring, so Lincoln's counterfeiters, they're basically called the Kentucky colony, move up to Wisconsin and started counterfeiting. Well, when you start sending fake dollars into a gold-backed system, it's going to reduce the value. When you're running a fiat currency like the North is doing, those extra dollars allowed Lincoln to pay for a ton of bills. A lot of extra soldiers got paid because of fake currency. So the counterfeiting during the quote-unquote Civil War actually benefited the North and hurt the South because one was on a sound monetary system.
Isn't that kind of similar to what BRICS is with the fiat dollar?
Yeah, like I said, we don't know what their we don't know exactly what BRICS is going to end up, what their monetary system is going to be proposed. We've heard it's going to be gold backed. I'd like to see a global currency that is backed by a basket of commodities, and I think you can use blockchain to make that some kind of type of a sound currency. I've heard a lot of really good proposals on that, but that's not the purpose of today's show. So let's not get too wonky on economics.
Agreed.
But the South was actually trying to run a sound currency. That was just my real point, and they got that made them vulnerable to the counterfeiters.
Well, just to be clear, originally I did ask you to come on to do the 2008 crash, so we are going to have you to come back on. I know we talked about Kolomoisky, and we will do that, but we need you to come on and do 2008 crash, and we will talk all about monetary policy and the fiat dollar and all of that on that show, because you would be the person to lead us through that conversation.
Yeah, I left Wall Street in 2009 because I had to look in the mirror and like what I saw, and I'd seen too much about how the sausage is made on Wall Street, and I couldn't stay around anymore. That's when I went independent, started my own firm.
God bless you. Yeah. Okay, so where are we now?
Well, we've got three main pillars,
Mm-hmm.
It really explains. I just think it's so simple that those maps we showed at the beginning of how the United States kept encroaching, towards Russian territory. This is a world power. You cannot keep doing that. I know you've covered the beginning of the Ukraine war ad nauseum, but that really, that's people need to understand that this is basically Russia trying to defend itself. As NATO's getting closer and closer and closer, and you cannot have Ukraine be part of NATO. That's too close for comfort. Now, let me ask you this. How significant do you think Trump's recent revelations, the Trump administration's recent revelations about the bioweapons labs in Ukraine are?
I think those are actually really significant, because I think Ukraine is, just like Congress, a crime scene. And that might be part of the reason that they're fighting tooth and nail to keep it out of the possession of Russia, is because they've invested so much of their corrupt infrastructure into Ukraine, and it's their little sandbox of evil.
Yeah, that story goes really, really deep, and I know you've had many guests on there that we've all dug really deeply into this stuff, and I think we're pretty close to on the same page on there.
So let's talk about what happens here at the end of the 90s, because I have the story here of exactly what happens with Yeltsin. So Yeltsin, there in August of 1998, there is a financial crisis in Russia. There's a financial crash, which is very much a product of the aluminum wars and everything that was happening with these oligarchs buying up all of these shares that were being given out to Russian citizens, and then the oligarchs are coming in and buying them up for pennies on the dollar, because the shares in the eyes of the Russian people weren't worth anything. They couldn't go buy groceries with them. So there's a financial crash in 1998, and that's when Yeltsin turns to Primakov, who's the foreign minister, and asks him to become the prime minister. And so he comes in. The Duma, which is the Russian Congress, is dominated by the communists, by communist factions. Now, Primakov is not a communist, but he's a great statesman. So he plays very well with all the different factions. He plays well with the capitalists. He doesn't consider himself a pure free market capitalist either. He likes a state regulated system, something in the middle. But he plays well with the capitalists. He plays well with the communists. And because of that, because he's so good at coming in and maneuvering and getting these people, mediating all these disputes, he becomes even more popular than Yeltsin is in just a matter of months. And so then that leads to May 1999. Yeltsin fires Primakov as prime minister, and he brings in this other guy, Stepson, I think is his name. And that's when Primakov leaves government. So he leaves the government, and then he comes back. I guess it would be 6 months later, a year later, in 2000, and announces that he is going to be running for president of Russia, and against Yeltsin. Yeltsin then, because Yeltsin has lost all of his popularity, he then turns around and he elevates his own candidate, and that guy's name was Vladimir Putin. And so once Putin gets elevated by Yeltsin, and in Yeltsin's mind, he's like, well, Putin was my prime, Putin has been working for me. He was my prime minister. I think Putin ends up serving as prime minister in 1999. for a short while. And we did cover that when we did the aluminum wars. And so when Putin comes in, Yeltsin thinks that Putin is going to be his guy, like almost like his puppet. And Yeltsin is, as you just said before, is very much like he is the puppet of these oligarchs from the aluminum war era. Whereas Primakov is not in bed with those people. And so when Yeltsin brings in Putin, because Putin had come up through the KGB and he'd come up through the system, they were like, oh, well, Putin's going to be our guy. But Putin wasn't their guy. And he even says in interviews how he's very respectful, but he basically is like, yeah, Yeltsin was a drunk and, you know, he was drunk all the time and like didn't know what he was doing at the end. Like he kind of lost his mental faculties and, you know, God bless him. But, you know, it was time to put him out to pasture. He was just drunk all the time. We watched that interview when we did the aluminum wars. But so Putin comes in, he ends up not, you know, whether he was brought in as a mole or he gets in and he turns on his masters, he doesn't end up being the guy that these oligarchs thought he was going to be on day one. And the minute that he gets nominated, Primakov withdraws his nomination. He's like, all right, well, if Putin's going to run, I'm cool. I'm cool with Putin. Putin can be president. And now we know that both Putin and Lavrov are like hardcore disciples of Primakov. So I don't have any smoking gun to say that this was all like a plan all along, but it certainly worked out well for the earnest nationalists in Russia that Putin did not end up being a puppet of the oligarchs.
Well, they actually in '99, Putin and Primakov were at one point in time rivals for it to be the next president. They were actually both in the
yes.
And then, which is interesting because shortly thereafter, Putin would then bring Primakov into his cabinet.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of talk about, Primakov. Yeltsin always said that Primakov was too close to the Russian Communist Party when they were talking about impeachment and things like that. But going back a little bit, talking about the 1998, the Russian economy. That had a lot of international impacts. LTCM, the long-term capital management crash, bailout in 1998. And again, we are a socialist country. We privatize profits, we socialize losses, and that's my ongoing criticism of the United States and pretty much the entire world. The rules-based order is these multinational corporations get a bailout. It's not free and fair trade. The interesting thing about it was that coupled with that 98 crash in Russia, is they also had a horrible harvest, like the worst since, the Good Dust Bowl era of the 1930s. And to me, it's got to be more than a coincidence that we get the 1929 stock market crash, which sets off the Great Depression, and all the farms start to fail. And the same thing happened to Russia in 98. I don't know, it sort of rhymes a little bit. I think there's probably more to that than we know. I've never seen anybody write about it, but it's just interesting to me what causes that to happen one right after the other.
That is interesting.
Yeah. And it just seems to lead into dramatically different regime changes right afterwards.
Yeah. That is interesting to think about. Yeah. What are your conclusions on that, or what are your thoughts on that?
I'd have to get a little bit of tinfoil hat on to really go.
Yeah, it's all right. We do tinfoil around here all the time. No shame in that.
I try not to do it too much. One of the things you want to talk about today was the sovereign alliance. And I'll put the challenge up to you and anyone else. I say, look, I understand the theory. I get where you're coming from. I've heard your arguments. I can't shoot them down. But I want to see one bit of evidence that China has ever worked in our favor, meaning some kind of a better global world favor, and is not working towards one world government. Because I say they've been doing that ever since Rockefeller went over there in 71 and brought them into the WTO. And I want to see one shred of evidence that Xi is actually the good guy that he has to be for your theory to be correct. I don't see the evidence, and I'm totally open to hearing it.
Matt Ehret wrote an article, I believe it was in 2020, it might have been in 2021, where I think the title of it is it possible for a mutually beneficial strategic decoupling from China? And basically the argument he makes is that it would be mutually beneficial because it would eliminate the slave caste in Southeast Asia, not just China, but the other countries as well. And then it would also allow America to onshore its manufacturing and restore its industrial base, which is basically what we're seeing Trump doing now. So
I understand it from Trump's perspective. What I'm asking for is, because I still see China, the CCP over and over again, doing the same anti-American antics. They're, apparently Trump just announced they tried to steal our election in 2020, and they got proof of it. We see them stealing our intellectual property all the time. We see them undercutting us on trade. We see all kinds of antics that are basically anti-U.S. interests. And I understand from China's standpoint, but show me evidence that stopped.
Well, so last night, Matt was actually on Burning Bright Show, The Narrative, and they spent the first hour and a half talking about this. I would encourage people to go listen to that.
I plan to, because Burning Bright gave that show a really big buildup, because this is a conversation I've been waiting to have for years. And I was afraid he was going to jump in front of the conversation I want to have with Matt, going back to John Locke. But
No. They end up spinning. He wanted to talk about the city of London, and they did end up getting there, but it took him 2 hours because they spent the first 2 hours talking about China. But fantastic conversations, and I've had some of these conversations with Matt as well. And if you go look at what is that campaign, the Tigers and Flies campaign, which was the anti-corruption campaign that Xi went on. Basically, what they're laying out, or what Burning Bright's laying out, and Matt is complimenting and supplementing with his own information, is what Donald Trump is doing right now with the American government and the American deep state. Xi has been doing as well. So there is very much a bad actor in China, but it's not a monolithic system, just like the American government is not a monolithic system.
I'm definitely going to have to go back and watch that, because, it'd be great. I would love for them to be correct.
Yeah.
I don't understand Chinese politics like I do American, because I'm not Chinese. I don't get it. I don't read Chinese language, and I don't trust any reporting that comes from there, and nor do I trust the American analysis of it. So it's very hard from this distance.
And just to be clear, the sovereign alliance theory, and I think Burning Bright would agree with this, is not the idea that at the end of all of this, it's going to be kumbaya and we're all going to be best friends and get along and there's never going to be conflict again. I think it's more of, there is a common enemy that we all need to defeat if we are going to have any chance at our own sovereignty and pursuing our own best interests. And then once that dust settles, there will be partners that are more favorable than others. I think Russia will end up being a much better partner, and our interests will align much more with Russia than they will with China. But from Russia's perspective, they're going to keep China close because China's their neighbor, and they already have a lot of economic entanglement with them. So I think that's how it all kind of balances itself out, where everyone's going to kind of keep one foot in each bucket. There won't be a monolithic or a monopolar, unipolar hegemony, but instead there will be a balance of powers where each party will look out for its own neighborhood, its own interests, and therefore one country doesn't have to have 800 plus military bases like the United States has, because Russia can take care of itself, China can take care of itself.
Yeah, I think we're all in agreement that there is an international network that goes beyond nation states, and it always has. It doesn't matter where the borders are, what's changed. This goes back centuries or more. I think everyone's in agreement that is the international syndicate, the shadow state that I talk about. And it runs through things like secret society, the Pilgrim Society. It runs the gamut of international diplomacy, multinational corporations. This is the network that wins no matter what, and it's in place. And the question is, are we actually going to be able to unwind it and still have a planet left over? Because that network can push a lot of buttons. Now, here's just the question: in my theory of this international network, China was brought in 1971 by again Rockefellers like that, and they started pushing this whole one global government climate change agenda that was a Hegelian dialectic thing. And I need to see evidence that any part of China is not still the muscle behind that effort, because. That's where I'm getting it. And I have not seen that evidence, and I understand their arguments. I just want the evidence of it. And I hope to God they're right. So I would love it. I would love a Winnie the Pooh, Trump and Putin. We're all shaking hands and having secret communications. But again, this international network is far more powerful than all three of those governments put together. They always survive everything. The network remains behind. They're the ones who finance every side of every conflict. They're the war profiteers. They're the bankers.
So take what I just said about going to watch The Narrative last night, and then also go check out Ash in America and CanCon's stuff, because I haven't had a chance to check in with them fully in the past few days. But you'll recall the speech that Trump gave the other night about election integrity. From what I've seen them post and from just passing comments I've had with them over the past few days, I believe, don't quote me, but I believe that their belief is that it was China who gave us the evidence. It was China who gave Trump the evidence that it was China who tried to steal or did steal or whatever the 2020 election, which would suggest that there's a good twin, evil twin in China. So if that's what happened, then and CanCon points to the fact that Trump, right before he gave the speech, he posted a picture of him and Xi together. I think maybe 2 pictures of him and Xi together. Stuff like, just kind of little signals like that. But they did have hard evidence. They were, if you go look at their X accounts, they have been posting. They've been going through these documents that have been getting released, and they've been citing stuff and saying, here's stuff that lines up with our research, etc. So we're getting a little off track here, but I would encourage people to go check out Why We Vote. Go check out Ash and CanCon's content. I know John's also been posting about this as well, so he's been looking into this. But then, of course, the narrative with Burning Bright and Matt Ehret. Between all those, I think at least some of your itch will be scratched a little bit by some of the stuff that they're talking about and putting out. But I'm not the China guy, so I can't be the China guy.
I don't know if anybody can.
I'm not the China guy. I am not the China guy. But anyway, all right. So let's round out this story that we were just talking about, because you're right that there are 2 factions initially where Putin is being backed by Yeltsin's team, these oligarchs. He brings in this guy Steppenshine, I think is like his name, Steppenshine, in May of 1999. He then replaces him in August of 1999, so 3 months later, replaces him with Vladimir Putin. And then Yeltsin announces that he wants Putin to succeed him as president. He was effectively asking the country to go ahead and treat Putin as the chosen heir before Putin had even really introduced himself to the public. And then it says, so why he was chosen. He was chosen by Yeltsin for several reasons. He had a reputation for personal loyalty and administrative discipline. He came from the security services, but was not yet an independent political heavyweight. He seemed capable of defeating Primakov's coalition. And Yeltsin's associates believed he would protect continuity and possibly shield the outgoing president and his family from investigations. So Primakov is being backed by a group that is, I think I had it right here. He was being backed by a group of nationalists. The Fatherland All Russia Alliance is what it's called. And it is a unity electoral bloc. Or I'm sorry, the Kremlin-backed political strategists create the unity electoral bloc, and they run against Primakov's Fatherland All Russia Alliance. And so Putin is basically being backed by the unity. But it says in the December 1999 parliamentary election, Unity performed unexpectedly well while sustained television attacks weakened Primakov's coalition. The result demonstrated the Kremlin could build an electoral base around Putin. And so then Yeltsin resigns early, so he leaves office before his term ends in December of 1999, the very last day, December 31st, 1999. He unexpectedly resigns months before his term is supposed to end. And so under the Russian constitution, the prime minister automatically becomes president when this happens. So Putin becomes acting president. And then I believe that is where the presidential election happens in March of 2000. He's now running as the incumbent because he's been president for 3 months. And then he ends up getting 53% of the vote in May of 2000. So I misunderstood. I thought that Primakov was pulled out of the race before the election actually happened. But Putin does bring Primakov into his administration, even though he keeps Primakov's coalition out of office, out of becoming the prime minister, he does bring Primakov into his circle.
And it's important to understand why he does that. And it's because Primakov had already been talking about this doctrine. The biggest concern for foreign policy for Russia at the time is we're seeing a bunch of quote unquote color revolutions across Central Asia. And they needed a counterbalance to that. And Primakov is the one who proposed the RIC type of, depolarization to give a balance of power and kind of help to offset what's going on with these Central Asian countries. And we were country after country. This is even before the Arab Spring. And, this is that's very alarming when you're Russia and right on your doorsteps. You only have NATO creeping in from the West, but you got countries that you were previously friendly with, and, American NGOs are sitting there, because everyone in power knows exactly what's going on with these other revolutions. It's the CIA working with NGOs, toppling governments that they don't play nice with American interests or the Anglo-American interests. They see these dominoes coming right up in their footstep, and they had to have a counterbalance. I bring this up because Primakov was kept by Putin, and then coached Putin specifically because he's the guy that had the foreign policy answers, and that's why the Primakov Doctrine is so important today, because they put this in place more than 25 years ago, for the exact same reason. Is NATO, and Anglo-American interests were creeping onto Russia's doorstep, and that's not okay. Especially if you're Russia, you needed a little bit of breathing room. They may not want to be at war with us, but they can't say it's not inevitable, or it'll happen eventually. And you get NATO parked around your front door. That's a hell of an advantage.
Yes. All right. So to round out this conversation, I do want to talk about the contrasting doctrine, which I don't actually consider to be contrasting. I think they actually complement one another. The Gerasimov doctrine. Are you familiar with him?
Gerasimov. Yeah.
Gerasimov. Okay. Before we get to him, we're going to hit a quick ad, and then we will come back and do and finish up this conversation. And that is, where did it go? River.
Your bank kept $1,600 from you in 2025. You probably didn't notice. Now multiply that by millions of Americans. That's over $433 billion in interest the banks kept. Your money goes in. Banks put it to work. They make record profits. You get almost nothing in return. And when they blow up, guess who has to bail them out? So what are you supposed to do? Ask politely? Wait? Accept that this is just how banking works? Or you could put your money where it works for you. On River, your cash earns 3.3%, paid in Bitcoin. Earning Bitcoin gives your money even more room to grow. And it's just as easy as how you bank today. You can get paid, pay your bills, and access your money anytime. Start banking with Bitcoin on River.
BadlandsMedia.tv/River. You will not regret it.
All right. Yep. Shout out to River. So let's talk about this real quick before we wrap up, because I do think that this is an interesting concept. And I do think that it works together with the Primakov Doctrine. So here is a Carnegie Endowment for International Peace article from June of 2019, written by Eugene Rumor. I think I'm saying his name right. Rumor. And I'll just read the intro. It says, since 2014, Russian quote unquote hybrid warfare has been at the center of attention of Western security analysts. The Kremlin's reliance on proxies, disinformation, and measures short of war has created the impression that its hybrid capabilities are distinct and separate from its military and can serve as a substitute for hard power. That impression is incorrect. Russian military and hybrid activities are tools are inextricably linked. Hybrid warfare has been associated with Russian Chief of the General Staff, General Valery,
Gerasimov,
the author of the so-called Gerasimov Doctrine, a whole-of-government concept that fuses hard and soft power across many domains and transcends boundaries between peace and wartime. Rather than a driver of Russian foreign policy, the Gerasimov Doctrine is an effort to develop an operational concept for Russia's confrontation with the West in support of the actual doctrine that has guided Russian policy for over 2 decades. The Primakov Doctrine, and then it goes on to explain, it's named after former Prime Minister Primakov. It posits that a unipolar world dominated by the United States is unacceptable to Russia and offers the following principles for Russian foreign policy: that Russia should strive for a multipolar world managed by a concert of major powers. Russia should insist on its primacy in the post-Soviet space and lead integration in that region. And Russia should oppose NATO expansion. The record of the past 2 decades reveals several key themes about the role of hard power in Russia's foreign and military policy. Military power is a necessary enabler of hybrid warfare. Hybrid tools can be an instrument of risk management when hard power is too risky, costly, or impractical, but military power is always in the background. And then it says nuclear weapons are the foundation of a country's national security and the ultimate guarantee of its strategic independence, but they are not an instrument for risky endeavors. They ensure that other powers do not engage in such endeavors against Russia. The implementation of the Primakov Doctrine has been anything but reckless. Russian uses of hybrid warfare and military power against Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine since 2014, as well as Syria since 2015, have been, and we've talked about Georgia and Ukraine so far. We're going to get to Syria, have been calibrated to avoid undue risk. Yet the intervention in Syria has also highlighted the limits of Russian hard power and hybrid warfare. Russian hard power is insufficient to impose the Kremlin's preferred version of peace on Syria, and Moscow lacks the vast economic and military resources to become a hegemon in the Middle East.
Let me get you to skip down. See where it says introduction below that?
Yep.
Go to the second paragraph and read the final sentence of the second paragraph.
Okay, final sentence of the second paragraph. It says, in it, and I think it's referring to a 2013 article, it says, in it, Gerasimov described a version of whole-of-government warfare that transcends boundaries between peace and wartime, best described as a fusion of various elements of soft and hard power across various domains. The Gerasimov Doctrine is, in other words, permanent conflict.
That's the key takeaway right there. Primakov Doctrine was trying to find a way to get a multipolar world where Russia could, coexist and, flourish, trading among equals. Gerasimov is a much more aggressive doctrine. Permanent conflict, total polarization, etc. So at least that's my takeaway on that. Do you agree, or?
Yeah. I can see what you're saying. You're saying that it's like the gray zone. I think is how it's also described, where it's like that area between war and peace. If war is white and peace is black, the gray zone is the area in between where you're just constantly in conflict. It is interesting how the Wikipedia page for the Gerasimov Doctrine is called New Generation Warfare. And then it talks about the Russian theory of unconventional warfare, which prioritizes the psychological and people-centered aspects over traditional military concerns, and emphasizes a phased approach of non-military influence such that armed conflict, if it arises, is much less costly in human or economic terms for the aggressor than it otherwise would be. So this sounds a lot like what General Flynn has described with the book that he published years ago, and then the subsequent volumes of that book, Fifth Generation Warfare.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I'd love to have ask General Flynn about this exact question.
Yeah. So, like, what I was going to say is, that if fifth generation warfare is always happening, because that's the takeaway I took from General Flynn's book, is that instead of it being a hard power conflicts in the future, it was just going to be perpetual soft power conflicts, and you were just going to have to be ever vigilant. Then the two working together does actually make sense, because the idea is not, of course, to antagonize or
kinetic. The idea is to avoid the kinetic war and
entirely.
Victory by other means.
Yes, yeah. So engaging only in soft power instead of hard power, and then leaning more on the Primakov Doctrine to facilitate, diplomacy, peace, and then when it does get into conflict, it just goes into soft power instead of hard power.
Where do you classify biological warfare?
Hard power for sure.
Yeah.
Yep. And so that then brings us back to the biolabs in Ukraine.
And the China question.
Yeah, and the China question for sure. Absolutely, the China question.
And I stay up at night. I do not know the answer to these questions I'm asking. I don't know. I don't think anybody, not on my pay grade, nobody knows or can know. We can make some pretty good guesses. We can tie a bunch of dots together, but there's some things that are just not knowable at this point in time. So I'm not going to draw a firm conclusion until I know more facts. And they may come the hard way. But I still hold a bit of a grudge over COVID.
I hold a major grudge over COVID. And if systems aren't torn down and people don't go to prison, then we can't have a society, frankly.
No, they can't give me back my parents, but we can have a reckoning. And I don't think a lot of us are not going to stop until that happens. And TikTok, we had about 2.5 years left. Got to see something on that front.
Absolutely. Well, awesome. Well, Brady, I really appreciate you being here and joining us tonight. This is pre-recorded, so I don't know if I always forget to say that at the beginning of the episode, but maybe it just keeps people on their toes by not saying it. So we don't have any live rants to read. If you are listening to this on replay, you can go to badlandsmedia.tv/boost, or just click on the boost at the top of the page, and you can leave a Rumble rant under the Book of Trump, and we will read it. I will read it next week. But Brady, why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Best place to find me is on X. It's war_hamster 1776. Hamster, of course, it does not have a P in it, people. It gets misspelled so many times with HAMPSTR. I see it all the time. And you can also get me. My biggest channel is on Rumble. Just go to Rumble, search for war_hamster. And that is me.
Yeah. And I mean, so much of what I know now about the intelligence community and CIA, I did learn from Brady and conversations with Brady over the years. I would highly encourage people to go check out his Rumble page because he has put so much work into putting together these presentations that explain a lot of the stuff, not just the CIA, but a lot of the banking institutions and other organizations.
Yeah, we're about 1/3 of the way through going through James Madison's notes from the Philadelphia Convention, word for word, line by line, because you can't really talk about original intent unless you understood what the guys who wrote the darn Constitution were actually arguing about. So we've been doing that line by line. It's on my show called the Federalist Report, which is also on the War Hamster channel. But those are, if you want to get your constitutional hat on, that's the place to do it. Douglas V. Gibbs, Mr. Constitution, joins me every Wednesday, and that's probably about as wonky in the Constitution as you'll find anywhere on the internet.
That's awesome. That is awesome. So what I'm going to do, guys, is I'm going to post the link to Brady's X account, to his Rumble page, and then also to that article that I was reading earlier from the 1997 Heritage Foundation article. Awesome. Well, thank you again, Brady, for being here. As I said, we are going to get you back. You and I can talk offline about our schedules because I want to bring you back to talk about the financial crisis, 2008, where we can talk all about money. And then I want to bring you back to talk about Kolomoisky, of course, because you were the first person I ever talked to about Kolomoisky. So it makes sense that we would do a show about him together.
Super. I have no idea what he's been up to lately. I haven't heard him much in the news, so we'll have to do some homework before that.
I believe he's been in prison. I think Zelensky threw him in prison a few years ago, and he's been rotting in prison, but which introduces a whole new wrinkle in that story. But those are things we'll hash out when we do the topic.
Give me a bit of notice. I'll be ready for you. Always a pleasure to step in. And like I said, you and I'd be having these conversations if we didn't have cameras. So,
absolutely. All right, guys, we are going to get out of here, and we're going to wrap up with a video from Soft Disclosure. So, thank you again. This has been the Book of Trump, the origins of the Sovereign Alliance, and we will see you next week.
No, Chi-Chi, we can't stop for snacks, dude. We have to deliver all of these Soft Disclosure gift cards.
He goes by Zach Kane.
The motion detector.
fighting over the beer brush.
Life finds a way.
Hydrate your elbows, moisturize your soul. Feel the rhythm together. You feel alive and let the lotion roll. Soft disclosure, hear the cry. Maximum softness, do or die.
Muffin, hit it.